nerds, what's up? You know I love discussing tropes and shifting definitions here, and today is no different. I've recently been thinking a lot of the term plot armor, specifically because when I did my review of the 5th A Song of Ice and Fire book, A Dance with Dragons, a lot of people talked about characters having plot armor. By definition, plot armor refers to the plot device where a fictional character is preserved from harm due to their necessity for the plot to continue. And it should be mentioned in today's usage, this term is used 99% of the time with a negative connotation. It's usually used as a sort of diss, like this story isn't believable or the author didn't have the nerve to kill a character. I went down a deep rabbit hole trying to discover the origin of the term plot armor, but I kept running to this issue of a circular reference. The Oxford English Dictionary lists a certain source, and then it's like everybody else lists that source according to the OED, but no one actually lists the link of the original time it was supposedly said. And I just hate it when everything starts referencing something else, but there's no link to the original source. It makes it unbelievable for me. Anyway, for the record, the OED lists the original source to be a Usenet site, alt.games.dir/trs/trap. Let me tell you, I spent way too long trying to track down this Usenet forum. Yes, Usenet, in our year 2024. You can imagine I was ultimately unsuccessful and had to move on. I did look at some other tools though to give me an idea of when this term might have originated. Now, like I said, the Usenet forum was credited as the early 2000s. I also used a Google Trend search, which obviously for various reasons isn't like very definitive, but I did find the results interesting. As you can see, again, the term picking up prominence in the late 2000s. Also, Urban Dictionary first got a entry for plot armor in 2008. So even though these aren't perfect methods, there is one consistent trend, which is that plot armor is a pretty modern term. Normally when I'm discussing tropes and fandom definitions on this site, a lot of them originated with the comic fandoms in the 1940s and on, so 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. The fact that plot armor is repeatedly linked to the late 2000s is fascinating and very, very new in terms of tropes. And I want to keep that in mind as we have today's conversation, and we can circle back to it. Anyway, today my real purpose here is to make a bold statement, which is that I don't think plot armor is a bad thing. I think it's kind of needed, you know, to tell a story. Yeah, if I'm reading a book called Harry Potter and there are 7 books, I sort of expect Harry to make it through all 7 books. Now, if you weren't around or in the fandom when Harry Potter was coming out, there actually was a big discussion before book 7 came out that Harry might die at the end. But before then, there was never that discussion because it seemed pretty obvious that a book about Harry Potter, Harry would survive. Yeah, Superman probably is always going to survive his situations in the comic called Superman. We kind of expect our main characters to survive the story they're in. Okay, I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit for comedic effect, but I do think there are some elements that go into this that make plot armor more or less believable. Firstly, I think an important element that is often missing in our discussions today of plot armor is that it needs to be an unreasonable survival, one that stretches credulity. But beyond that, I also want to say it's likely repeated instances of unreasonable survival. And so I want to make the point that plot armor in itself isn't bad, it's bad writing that's bad. We probably don't think a lot about the fact that our main character is surviving the story, because that's pretty typical, until the writing becomes bad, until we are writing scenes that aren't believable anymore. There are a few specific things that I think make the idea of plot armor particularly noticeable. The first being if death is the only stakes in your novel. If your characters don't have other stakes, whether emotional or physical, and death is the only thing creating drama or emotion, then I think it will be noticeable if your character continues to survive or the characters around them. If death is the only fear and the reader doesn't have anything else to fear, it's going to be noticeable when the bad thing continually doesn't happen. Again, I think this is a product of bad writing in general, to not have deep enough motivations for other things to have stakes besides death. And 2, like I mentioned before, if the author continually puts their character in increasingly ridiculous situations that it feels impossible to survive over and over and over again, yeah, you're gonna start noticing that a character feels invincible when they shouldn't. And again, that's gonna relate to number 1, where if those are the only stakes, and nothing ever happens, the stakes are gonna feel less and less and less, and you're gonna feel less emotionally connected to the story. There's also things to consider within the narrative and the extent of plot armor. For example, a single narrative story is going to rely on plot armor a lot more than a multi-perspective story, just out of necessity for the fact that you're probably going to need your viewpoint character to survive the novel to tell the story. A good example of this to me is The Hunger Games, which has our main character Katniss obviously going to be in very extreme life or death situations, but we pretty much expect Katniss to make it out because she's our single viewpoint of the story. So it makes sense. The Hunger Games works though because there's a lot of stakes there, obviously death of other characters, but also a lot of emotional and political stakes. And so it's okay that we know Katniss may survive some slightly ridiculous situations. Also, I think the genre and the expectations of the novel or property play a big role in plot armor. If you do any sort of research on this trope topic, the one property that seems to come up a lot as the example is James Bond. And in conjunction with that, I was thinking of kind of more of a fantasy related property that might reminded me of the complaints about James Bond. And I thought of a book I read recently, which was Dungeon Crawler Carl. Now I've only read book 1 so far, so I don't know, but I would expect that Carl's gonna survive all the books. And based on the story, I expect that he's gonna face increasingly ridiculous situations and get out of them. And isn't that the point? Isn't that why I'm literally reading the book? To watch in a fun and ridiculous way how this character has to increasingly survive more and more heightened and ridiculous situations? I don't go to a James Bond movie to feel realistic. I go to watch a James Bond movie to see a dude doing really cool stunts that are out of this world. Yeah, because that's fun and cool and awesome. It's kind of a part of the genre. So like, oh, James Bond has plot armor. Yes, that's literally the point. That's the point of that genre of movie. So at this point, I want to circle around back to A Song of Ice and Fire, because apparently everything I do now circles back to A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm about to say a significant spoiler for book 1 or season 1 of the Game of Thrones TV show. So if you have not participated in either of those things, I would skip to the next section if you don't want to be spoiled. I think A Song of Ice and Fire is actually really interesting in the plot armor discussion because Martin did buck so many expectations and the plot armor trope by killing Ned Stark in book 1. Literally changed a generation of fantasy. Like, that will go down in history, right, as extremely influential. So it's really interesting to me to see the conversations that have arisen out of book 5 for plot armor, and also it seems like later seasons of the show, although since I haven't watched it, I can't comment on those particular discussions. It's almost like because Martin bucked tradition so much by killing Ned and obviously killing some other characters later in the series, that suddenly when he is not killing characters, it's like this reverse thing happens where people feel like there's plot armor suddenly, even though of any author, I'd feel like Martin's characters don't have plot armor. But at some point, some of his characters need to survive to tell the story. And in my opinion, I just couldn't disagree more with these assertions about book 5. I think the important thing is, I remember when I was writing, don't get excited, I'm not gonna write a novel, but many moons ago when I thought I was going to, I did a lot of research and I can't remember where I read this, so I feel bad, I have no source. But it might have been a podcast episode, might have been Writing Excuses actually. Okay, doesn't matter. But it said, if you kill a character, there needs to be a purpose. Just killing a character to kill a character to make your reader sad, if it has no purpose within the story, it's not good. And at the time, that was a really novel thought for me, because I had thought of just killing characters to make my reader sad, and didn't think of what's the point of the narrative. And I've talked about this a lot in other videos, but Martin is the king of making a character's death mean something. Ned Stark's death, the reason I think, again, people miss when they try to do shocking deaths, the reason his death matters so much is not only who he is as a character in that novel, but also the continual effect that it has on every other character and every other plot point for the rest of the series. And that's why it's so remarkable. I think too often we remove the single event. So if we get to book 5 and it's like, well, Martin isn't killing so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, well, there probably isn't a point. It's probably not going to affect the story in the same way or in a way that is beneficial to the overall story that Martin is trying to tell. I also want to say, book 5 is an interesting one because there's also a character that dies in book 5 that people say it's stupid because there's no way, because Martin's wasting our time if that happens. And like, so what you're saying is that he didn't have plot armor. Okay, I'm not gonna be on that anymore. I can't say the name because I didn't say there was gonna be book 5 spoilers here, but wouldn't it be hilarious about when Winds comes out, if that character is alive? I'll take it all back. You guys can make fun of me if it is. There's one more thing I wanna talk about that I wonder if it's contributing to these sorts of discussions, because while I was researching, it came up a lot, which is the internet phenomenon that nothing is real. There's often this new attitude on the internet that you can see a lot in comments on photos or reels or shorts or whatever, that this is staged, this is clearly fake, this is, you know, whatever. I think because so much can be staged now with special effects and influencers, we kind of get into this pattern of really believing that nothing can happen. And I thought of this a lot because I used to be on Reddit, and there was a very popular sub called That Happened. And a lot of times people would post things and the comments would be like, well, some things happen, this sounds like it could happen. And there would always be arguments on whether these stories were made up or not. And that's sort of the thing, right? A famous quote attributed to Mark Twain says, "Truth is stranger than fiction." We hear that a lot. I think we expect, oddly, a sort of believability to our fiction in many regards. Even if something could happen in life, if it seems too out there, we will get mad at it. Even though in life, sometimes 1 in a million things do actually happen. And while we usually shorten that Mark Twain quote, I actually want to read the entire thing because I actually think it is more suited to this discussion. The full Mark Twain quote actually reads, "Truth is stranger than fiction, but it is because fiction is obliged to stick to the possibilities. Truth isn't." Ultimately, it's obviously a careful balance. If we could list in a to-do list what makes a good story, a lot more people would be successful writers. Sometimes there is a nebulous and unattainable quality about what makes something good. But as my final piece, I just want to reiterate that plot armor in itself, to me, is a very necessary and normal thing, even though it is used very negatively in today's connotation, that we just overuse it, like we always do. I think plot armor should only really describe when maybe a situation is overly unbelievable over and over again. And I do wonder if there is a connection to how late this term has appeared. I do wonder if it is related to the rise of the internet, to the rise of certain TV content, or the way we interact with media. Because once again, what was going on in the late 2000s that might have made us more susceptible to bringing the idea of plot armor to the forefront? I don't have an answer to that, but I'd love if you guys tried to answer that in the comments, why this might be a newer phrase in fandom. And you might try to argue, well, I want realism. I want it to be realistic. And besides the fact that I already talked about truth maybe being stranger than fiction, I also want to say, like, I don't know if that's true. I was thinking, like, there's a reason that memoirs are more popular than biographies, right? Way more people read memoirs than biographies. And that's because memoirs have a very kind of fictional story arc to them. Because they are only taking a portion of someone's life, they really fall into classic narrative structure. Because I think we like reading and experiencing story since the dawn of time. There is a reason that there are very classic hero journey, I couldn't think of the word, classic hero's journey. There are a reason there are these classic storytelling staples, because I do think ultimately they are very satisfying. And I legitimately think part of that storytelling staple is a bit of plot armor for our characters. So anyway, tell me your thought about plot armor. Does it bug you? Does it not? Do you agree that plot armor is extremely necessary and should probably be used as a criticism a lot less? Argue with me about the thing I made fun of in Dance with Dragons. You know, just any of your opinions. And if you like these kind of deep dives, please like and subscribe. That's the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.